The girl was standing outside the wire, watching him eat. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old. Her dress was torn and dirty, her hair hung in tangles. Her eyes, enormous in her thin face, followed every movement of his spoon as if watching a religious ceremony. Private George Whitmore looked at his bowl of watery soup. Cabbage, mostly. A few scraps of potato, maybe 200 calories, barely enough to keep a grown man alive. Then he looked at the girl. "We haven't eaten in 2 days," she said in German. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the gesture, her small hand touching her stomach, her face crumpling with the effort of asking for something she had been taught never to ask for. It was February 1945. The war was almost over. George Whitmore was a prisoner in Stalag VII-A, half-starved himself, surviving on rations that wouldn't have kept a dog healthy. And he gave his dinner to a German child. What happened in the weeks that followed, the choice that spread through the camp, the children who gathered at the fence, the secret system that defied every rule of war, would prove that even prisoners can choose who they want to be. Even the powerless can choose kindness. If this story moves you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more untold stories from World War II. These accounts deserve to be remembered. George Whitmore was born in 1919 in a terraced house in Salford, Greater Manchester. His father worked in a cotton mill. His mother raised 5 children on wages that never quite stretched far enough. George knew hunger, not the distant, abstract kind, the real kind. The kind where you went to bed with your stomach cramping and woke up the same way. The kind where you learnt to fill yourself with water because there wasn't anything else. "Hunger's a teacher," his mother used to say. "It teaches you what matters and what doesn't. It teaches you to share, because you know what it's like to have nothing." George carried those words with him when he enlisted in 1940. He carried them through basic training, through deployment to France, through the chaos of the retreat that ended at Dunkirk. He carried them into captivity when his unit was overrun in May 1940, and he carried them through nearly 5 years as a prisoner of war. By February 1945, George was 25 years old, but looked 40. His body had wasted away to skin and bones. His teeth were loose from malnutrition. He had survived dysentery, pneumonia, and the creeping despair that killed men as surely as any disease. But he had also survived with his humanity intact. That was harder than surviving physically. Plenty of men in the camp had given up, had become selfish, vicious, willing to steal from their own comrades to get an extra scrap of bread. George understood the impulse. He didn't judge them for it, but he refused to become that. "We're still men," he would tell the soldiers in his barracks. "We're still British. We don't let the bastards turn us into animals." It was a fine principle. It would be tested in ways George never imagined. Stalag VII-A was one of the largest POW camps in Germany, located near the town of Moosburg in Bavaria. By 1945, it held over 100,000 prisoners. British, American, French, Soviet. Men from a dozen nations crammed into a facility designed for a fraction of that number. The conditions were brutal. The rations were barely sufficient to sustain life. The guards, many of them old men or walking wounded unsuited for combat, varied from indifferent to actively cruel. Disease spread easily in the overcrowded barracks. Men died every week. But outside the wire, things were worse. Germany was collapsing. The Allied bombing campaign had destroyed cities, infrastructure, supply lines. The Eastern Front was crumbling, sending millions of refugees fleeing westward. The farms that fed the nation had been stripped bare by military requisitions and the chaos of total war. The civilians were starving, and the children were starving fastest. George first noticed them in late January, small figures hovering at the edges of the camp, watching through the wire with hollow eyes. Refugees mostly, families fleeing the Soviet advance with nothing left but the clothes on their backs. The guards chased them away when they could, but there were too many refugees and too few guards, and the children kept coming back. They gathered along the fence line like ghosts, watching the prisoners eat their meagre rations with a hunger that was almost physical to witness. George tried not to look at them. It was easier that way. He had his own survival to worry about, his own starvation, his own desperate hope that the war would end before his body gave out. Then, on February the 14th, 1945, the girl appeared at his section of the fence. She was alone. That was the first thing George noticed. Most of the children came in groups, siblings, neighbours, clusters of orphans travelling together for safety. But this girl stood by herself, small and fragile, watching George eat with eyes that held no hope, only hunger. He tried to ignore her. He told himself it wasn't his responsibility. He was a prisoner, for God's sake. He barely had enough food to keep himself alive. What was he supposed to do? But she didn't leave. She just stood there, her hands gripping the wire, her face pressed against it as if she could absorb nourishment through proximity alone. "We haven't eaten in 2 days," she said. George didn't speak German, but he understood. Some things don't need translation. He looked at his bowl. Half empty already, he'd been eating slowly, savouring each mouthful, making the meal last as long as possible, because the next one wouldn't come for 12 hours. He looked at the girl. He thought about his mother's words, "Hunger's a teacher. It teaches you to share because you know what it's like to have nothing." He walked to the fence. The guards were supposed to prevent contact between prisoners and civilians, but the guards were tired, demoralised, barely paying attention. George slipped his bowl through a gap in the wire. "Here," he said. "Take it." The girl stared at the bowl, at him, at the bowl again. Then she grabbed it and ate so fast, George was afraid she'd choke. She didn't use the spoon, just lifted the bowl to her mouth and drank the soup like water, not stopping until every drop was gone. When she finished, she looked at him with those enormous eyes. "Danke," she whispered. "Thank you. Danke." Then she ran away. And George stood at the fence with an empty stomach and a strange feeling in his chest that he couldn't quite name. That night, he told his bunkmates what he'd done. There were 5 of them in the close circle, men who had been together since Dunkirk, who had survived nearly 5 years of captivity by looking out for each other. Private James Fletcher, Corporal William Ellis, Privates Robert Davies, Thomas Mitchell, and Patrick O'Brien. "You gave away your dinner?" Fletcher asked incredulously. "George, you're skin and bones already. You can't afford to skip meals." "I know." "Then why did you do it?" George thought about how to explain, about his mother, about hunger as a teacher, about the look in the girl's eyes. "Because she needed it more than I did," he finally said. "Because she was a child. Because—" he stopped. "Because I couldn't watch her starve when I had food in my hands." The barracks was quiet. "There are hundreds of them out there," O'Brien said slowly. "Hundreds of starving children. You can't feed them all." "I know. So what's the point? You give away 1 meal, you save 1 child for 1 day. Tomorrow she'll be hungry again. Tomorrow there'll be more children. What does it accomplish?" George didn't have an answer. He knew O'Brien was right. 1 meal wouldn't change anything. 1 meal wouldn't save Germany's children from the catastrophe their country had brought upon itself. But he also knew something else. "When I was a boy," he said, "we were poor, dirt poor. There were times we didn't eat for days. And I remember a neighbour, Mrs. Callahan, who had even less than we did. But she shared with us anyway. Gave us bread when she barely had enough for herself." He looked at his bunkmates. "I asked my mother once why Mrs. Callahan did that, why she gave away food she couldn't spare, and my mother said, because that's what makes us human. Not hoarding what we have, but sharing it. Because when you help someone who needs it, you're not just saving them, you're saving yourself." The barracks was silent. "I'm not trying to save Germany," George said quietly. "I'm trying to save myself. I'm trying to stay human in a place that wants to turn us into animals. And if that means giving my dinner to a starving child, then that's what I'll do." Fletcher sighed. "You're a bloody fool, George Whitmore." "Probably. But if you're going to be a fool, I might as well be one too." Fletcher looked at the others. "What do you say, lads? Can we spare a bit from our rations? Pull what we can." Davies nodded slowly. "I'm in." "Me too," said Mitchell. "Might as well," O'Brien agreed. "Not like we've got anything better to do." Ellis didn't say anything. He just reached under his bunk and pulled out a tin of biscuits he'd been hoarding from a Red Cross package. "For the children," he said. The system they developed was simple but dangerous. Each man contributed what he could spare: a portion of soup, a crust of bread, half a biscuit. They pooled the contributions into a single cache, hidden in the barracks. Then, at dusk each day, George would take the food to a specific section of the fence where the children gathered. Word spread quickly. Within a week, there were dozens of children coming to that stretch of wire every evening. Within 2 weeks, there were more than 100. The operation expanded to include other barracks. Other prisoners, hearing about what George's group was doing, wanted to participate. Some gave food, some gave clothing, coats and blankets that the children needed as desperately as they needed nutrition. Some simply stood watch, keeping an eye out for guards who might interfere. "We're running a bloody charity," Fletcher observed one evening, watching George distribute the day's collection to a crowd of eager, hollow-eyed children. "I suppose we are." "The guards are going to notice eventually." "Probably." "What happens then?" George shrugged. "Then we deal with it. But until then, we keep feeding them." He handed a piece of bread to a boy who couldn't have been more than 5. The boy looked at it like it was made of gold. "Danke," the boy whispered. "Danke, Englischer." "Thank you, Englishman." The guards noticed in early March. Sergeant Hoffman was one of the older guards, a veteran of the First War, tired and disillusioned, counting the days until this one ended. He caught George at the fence one evening, surrounded by children, distributing food that prisoners were supposed to keep for themselves. "What is this?" Hoffman demanded. "What are you doing?" George's German was limited, but he'd learned enough over 5 years to manage basic communication. "Feeding children," he said. "They're hungry. These are German children." "Their children?" Hoffman stared at him. His face was unreadable. "You are prisoner. You have barely enough food for yourself. Why do you give it away?" George thought about his mother, about Mrs. Callahan, about the strange feeling in his chest that he still couldn't quite name. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. Hoffman was silent for a long moment. "I have grandchildren," he finally said. "In Dresden. I don't know if they're alive. The bombing—" He shook his head. "I don't know. I'm sorry." "You're sorry? British bombs destroyed their city. Your people killed them. And you're sorry?" "I didn't drop those bombs. I've been in this camp for 5 years. All I can do is what's in front of me, and what's in front of me is hungry children." Hoffman looked at the children gathered at the fence, at their thin faces, their desperate eyes, at the British prisoner who was giving them food he couldn't afford to spare. "This is against regulations," he said. "I know. I should report you. I know. You would be punished. Solitary confinement, reduced rations." "I know." Hoffman was quiet. "My shift ends in 15 minutes, he finally said. "The next guard is young and stupid. He won't notice anything." He turned and walked away. George stood at the fence, his heart pounding, and realized what had just happened. A German guard had looked the other way. A small mercy, in a war full of cruelty. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone could do. The girl came back. George learned her name was Elsa. She was 7 years old. Her father had been killed on the Eastern Front. Her mother had died in the refugee columns, somewhere between their village and here. She had been travelling alone for weeks, surviving on whatever scraps she could find. She attached herself to George like a shadow. Every evening she was there at the fence, waiting for him. She learned a few words of English. He learned a few words of German. They communicated mostly through gestures and expressions, through the universal language of care. "Why?" she asked him one evening. It was the same question, "Why are you kind?" that so many children had asked. "Because you're a child," George said, "and children shouldn't starve." "But I am German. You are English. We are enemies." "You're 7 years old. You're not my enemy. You're just a little girl who's hungry." Elsa looked at him with those enormous eyes. "My mother told me the English were bad," she said slowly. "She said you would hurt us." "Your mother was wrong. Some English are bad. Some are good. Same as Germans. Same as everyone. You are good." George smiled sadly. "I try to be. It's hard, sometimes. But I try." Elsa reached through the wire and touched his hand. Just for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for trying." The war ended on May 8, 1945. American forces liberated Stalag VII-A 3 days earlier. The gates opened. The prisoners, more than 100,000 of them, walked out into a world that had changed beyond recognition. George should have been overjoyed. He was free. He was going home. 5 years of captivity were finally over, but he couldn't leave without finding Elsa. He searched the refugee camps that had sprung up around Moosburg. He asked everyone he met, "Have you seen a 7-year-old girl, thin, brown hair, travelling alone?" Most people shook their heads. The chaos was too great, the displaced too many for anyone to track individual children. He was about to give up when he heard a voice. "George!" She came running through the crowd, thin, dirty, but alive. She threw herself at him and wrapped her arms around his legs. "George, I found you! I found you!" George knelt down and held her. This German child, this daughter of his enemies, who had somehow become something more. "I have to go home," he said gently. "To England. I can't stay." Elsa's face crumpled. "I have no home," she whispered. "No mother. No father. No one." George felt his heart breaking. "There are people who will help you," he said. "Good people. Organizations that take care of children like you." "I don't want organizations. I want you." George looked at her. At this child he had fed through a wire fence. At the bond they had formed across barbed wire and enemy lines. He thought about what was possible, what was impossible, what he was willing to do. "Come with me," he said. The bureaucracy was nightmarish. A British soldier adopting a German war orphan? There were no procedures, no precedents, no one who knew how to handle such a request. George was shuttled between offices, asked to fill out forms that didn't exist, told repeatedly that what he was attempting was impossible. He didn't give up. He wrote letters to every authority he could think of. He called in favours from officers who remembered him from before his capture. He found allies in the Red Cross, in the refugee agencies, in the chaos of the occupation administration. It took 4 months. 4 months of waiting, of uncertainty, of not knowing if he would be forced to leave Elsa behind. But in September 1945, he walked onto a ship bound for England with a 7-year-old German girl holding his hand. He had written to his mother explaining everything. Her response had been simple. "Bring her home. We'll figure out the rest." Elsa Whitmore grew up in Salford. It wasn't easy. There was prejudice, suspicion, the lingering hatred of a war that had cost Britain so much. Some neighbours refused to speak to the family. Some children at school tormented Elsa for being German. But she had George. She had his mother, who treated her like a granddaughter from the first moment they met. She had a home, a family, a future that should have been impossible. She learned English. She excelled at school. She became, in every way that mattered, as British as anyone else in Salford. But she never forgot where she came from, and she never forgot what George had done for her. "You saved my life," she told him once. When she was 16 and old enough to understand the full weight of what had happened. "I gave you some soup," George replied. "You saved yourself." "You gave me more than soup. You gave me hope. You showed me that not everyone in the world wanted me to die." George shrugged. He was never comfortable with gratitude. "I just did what my mother taught me. Share what you have. Help who you can. The rest takes care of itself." George Whitmore died in 1989 at the age of 70. Elsa was at his bedside. She was 51 years old now, a mother herself, with children who called George Grandad, even though they shared no blood. "Thank you," she said, holding his hand, "for everything." "You've thanked me 1,000 times, George said weakly. "It's getting embarrassing. I'll thank you 1,000 more." "I'll thank you for the rest of my life." George smiled. "Just keep sharing," he said. "That's all the thanks I need. When you have something and someone needs it, share, pass it on. That's how we stay human. I promise." "Good." He closed his eyes. "Good." Those were his last words. Elsa Whitmore spent the rest of her life keeping that promise. She became a social worker, specializing in refugee children. She spent 40 years helping displaced kids find homes, find families, find hope. She told them all the same story, about a British prisoner of war who gave his dinner to a German girl, about kindness that crossed enemy lines, about the power of sharing what you have. "That's how we stay human," she would say, echoing George's words. "Not by hoarding what we have, but by giving it away." In 2005, on the 60th anniversary of VII-A Day, Elsa was interviewed by the BBC about her wartime experiences. The interview went viral. Millions of people heard the story of George Whitmore and the children at the fence. Letters poured in from around the world, from survivors of other camps, from children who had been fed by Allied prisoners, from descendants of those children, now grown with families of their own. "I didn't know my grandmother was one of the children at Stalag 7A, one letter read. "I didn't know she was alive because a British soldier shared his food. Now I understand why she always told us to share everything we had." She was passing on what she learned. The ripples kept spreading. Elsa Whitmore died in 2018 at the age of 80. At her funeral, her son read from a letter she had written to be opened after her death. "I was 7 years old when I met George Whitmore. I was starving. I was alone. I had lost everything. He gave me his dinner, one bowl of watery soup. It shouldn't have been enough to matter. It shouldn't have been enough to change anything. But it changed everything. Because it wasn't just soup. It was proof that kindness existed. It was evidence that enemies could choose to be human. It was a lesson I've carried for 70 years, that what we share matters more than what we keep. George taught me that hunger is a teacher. It teaches you what matters. It teaches you to share, because you know what it's like to have nothing. I had nothing. George had almost nothing, and he shared anyway. That's the legacy I want to leave. Not the story of what was done to me, but the story of what was given to me. Not the cruelty of war, but the kindness that survived it. "We haven't eaten in 2 days, I told him, and he gave me his meal. Pass it on." The Imperial War Museum now includes George Whitmore's story in its collection of POW experiences. The display features photographs, documents, and a worn metal bowl, the same bowl George used to carry soup through the wire fence in 1945. The text reads, "In memory of George Whitmore and the prisoners of Stalag 7A, who proved that sharing what we have is what makes us human, February 1945. We haven't eaten in 2 days. Here, take it." This is a story that needed to be told. If it impacted you, please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel for more true accounts from World War II. These stories, though buried in time, still speak to us today about the power of sharing, the possibility of kindness across enemy lines, and the truth that what we give away matters more than what we keep.